Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now. Okay, we're going to begin. Welcome to the Stoa. I am the steward of the Stoa, Peter Lindberg, and I'm viewing the Stoa as a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this moment. And this is not only a place for us to practice and talk about Stoicism, but it's a place to explore with new practices and psychotechnologies and kind of put us at the edge of our thinking. And we have a great guest today, Michael Tremblay, a friend of mine who is in the Stoic movement. And he's going to talk today about a Stoic training program, how that will look. So I'll hand it over to Michael and in a moment, and he's going to give maybe about a 20-minute talk, and then we're going to open up to question and answers. And how that's going to work, just write down your question in the chat box, and then I will call your name and then just unmute yourself and ask Michael your question. If you prefer I read your question on your behalf, just indicate that in the chat box as well. And we'll ask maybe a few questions. The questions might go all the way to the hour. We'll be ending at the hour mark, or we might split up into some kind of group facilitated conversation in different breakout rooms. So we're just going to play that by ear. So that being said, I'm going to hand it over to Michael. No, let's just see. You're muted right now. I did a mass mute, so maybe that's.
I can unmute myself.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Okay, great. It's my first time using Zoom, so I'm still figuring it out. Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. Just really exciting to see so many people. Yeah. Hi, Max. Hi to see so many people discussing Stoicism or interested in this topic. I really like nerding out about it, so it's cool there's other people interested. A bit about myself. I'm a PhD candidate at Queen's University in Ontario, Canada, and I study Epictetus there. So I study Stoicism. I'm doing a PhD in philosophy. And specifically what I study is I study moral education in ancient Greek philosophy, specifically in Epictetus. But I'm really interested in this question. So you can think of a lot of ethics as being concerned with what is good and what is bad and what is right and wrong. And I'm more so interested in this question of moral education, which is like, given that we have an established theory of what is right and wrong, how do we transform ourselves to be the kind of people that can act successfully on our understanding of right and wrong and good and bad? So not so much this question of what virtue is, but this question of how do I go about cultivating virtue and transforming myself? And I think that that's just a much more interesting question. It was a question that we've lost interest in contemporary philosophy, but was really at the forefront of ancient philosophy, this idea of self-transformation. And a lot of the times when we engage in ethics and we engage in philosophy, it can be easy to lose sight of that. And what makes Epictetus special at it was he was actually a teacher, right? So he actually taught Stoic philosophy, and what we have from him is an outline of how a program of moral education would function and work. So I'm going to talk a bit about that program, the three kind of areas of study, the three topoi, the three disciplines it's sometimes been called, and how training in those would look. Great. Yeah, so I guess questions are at the end, so I'll just get started. I'm going to assume everybody has kind of a working background with Stoicism. I'll try to fill some things in, and then I'll go from there. And I'm also trying to do this in a way where it can be applicable or interesting for those who don't agree with Stoicism's value, that the only thing that matters is what is up to us, or the only good and bad is virtue and vice, and try to look at some ways of working this program in for people with different value systems as well. Great. So the first part of Epictetus's program, moral education, divides into three portions, and each portion needs to be mastered sequentially. So they can all be studied, but you need to master the first before you can master the second, before you can master the third. And it's only after the mastering of all three do we achieve virtue and become sages and virtuous, wise individuals. So these kind of go in a progressing order. So beginning with the first one, this is the one that is famously corresponds to physics, which is about the way things are. But really what Epictetus talks about it being, it's about mastering desire and aversion. And what desire and aversion are those are the strongest impulses that we feel. They're the strongest emotional or physiological responses we feel towards things. And what Epictetus points out is that desire and aversion correspond to value judgments about good and bad, right? So good, as we think of good as being the best kind of thing, the thing that always benefits us. This is like a technical term. And then bad as being the worst kind of thing, the thing that always harms us. So desire and aversion are these feelings that we feel that correspond to these two kinds of value judgments. And when you begin life and you don't begin life studying philosophy, you develop these kind of value judgments unintentionally and uninformed. And then what happens is you end up suffering or being at the mercy of these emotional, physiological responses because you view the wrong kinds of things as being good and bad. So the way to master desire and aversion, as Epictetus says, is not to not feel desire and aversion, it's not to be apathetic, but it's to feel desire and aversion for the correct kinds of things. And so he talks that the start of philosophy is we want to be intentional about our value system. We want to be intentional about what we view as good and bad and what we feel desire and aversion for, what we feel pulled towards, what we feel drawn away from. So we recognize this, we want to live intentionally. And then what we do is next thing we do is we actually suspend our judgments. So we go from people who function assuming things are good and bad, function feeling desire and aversions and passions that correspond to that, anger when we think something wrongs us, or happiness when we think something benefits us. And we take a step back from that. Because when we're in this mode, and this is what Epictetus, this is why it's the first area of study, is desires and aversions, when they're frustrated, they correspond to passions. And passions interrupt our capacity to reason properly. So if you're an untrained person just beginning your philosophical journey and you're starting to think, well, what kind of philosophy do I agree with? How do I want to live? Your passions are going to pull you around and they're going to disrupt your capacity to reason. So the first thing we do is we suspend our judgments. We take a step back and go, okay, I don't know what good and bad is. And then the next thing we do is we look for a standard, a way to test that and a way to evaluate that, a way to make sense of the world around us. And so for Epictetus, this is Stoic philosophy, but I think this is good advice for anybody, whatever philosophy that would be. You take a step back. So the very beginning of philosophy is you say, I want to live intentionally and I want to live correctly. It's the very beginning. Then the next thing you do is you take a step back and you say, well, I haven't been living intentionally and correctly, so I don't know. I'm in a position of ignorance. So I take a step back from my commitments, from my value judgments, and I look for a way to make sense of the world. I look for a way to evaluate the world. And what you end up doing is you either take up Stoicism, you take up Epicureanism, Aristotelianism, or some sort of contemporary method of value, consequentialism, utilitarianism, deontology. You find some way of making sense of the world and evaluating good and bad things and good and bad actions. And then what you do is you take that standard and you carefully apply it to the world around you, cautiously, intentionally, and one at a time. So what you do is you take a step back from your value judgments, you enter a state of ignorance, and then you one by one reintegrate objects, situations, people, and you reevaluate them with this standard, with this philosophy that you've developed. This in Epictetus's program, this is Stoic theory, Stoic philosophy. Things that are good is virtue, and things that are bad is vice. And you apply that judgment to all objects, situations, types of things you pursued in the past, types of things that you've been afraid of in the past, like death or like wealth or popularity. And you go about reintegrating these objects into your life carefully and one by one. And the point with this is this has to be the starting point of philosophy, because until we do this, we are just going to be disrupted by our passions in a way that, like, if we try to skip this step and you skip taking a position of ignorance and slowly building, and you just try to act on what you endorse in terms of theory, your passions are going to be disrupt that capacity, and you're not going to be able to act on what you think is what you take in theory to be the right thing. So taking a step back from this, what I think the call for here is the first step of philosophy is to recognize that your value systems and your beliefs influence your motivations and influence your emotional and your passionate states, right? So we take that. So then we say that it's better to have no beliefs than to have harmful beliefs and wrong beliefs. So what we do is we move from the state, a recognition that our beliefs influence our motivations and our emotional state. And then the next part of Stoic training is to assume a skeptical and ignorant position. And then what we do is we carefully, one by one, reintegrate beliefs and reintegrate things into our value system. So this is the first step, mastering of desire and aversion, as Epictetus says. And what I think is really interesting about this is it's just a call to live intentionally, and it's a call that a flawed value system can be more harmful than nothing. And I think that works no matter your value system or no matter if you don't agree with Stoic philosophy all the way. And then once we've done that, we should hopefully be motivated with extremely strong, passionate, producing emotions, only towards the kinds of things that we actually view as good and the kinds of things that we actually view as bad. And this is just and then that would be the state of mastering desire and aversion, which takes time and takes work, but that's what we're looking to get to. So the state where, in the Stoic terms, I'm not grieved by a sense of by a fear of death. That's not allowing me or preventing me from doing the kinds of things I want to do. I'm not being tempted or coerced by other people who are threatening me, because my states of passions and emotions are under control. So I'm going to try to do this in 20 minutes. So I'm going to move ahead to the next one, and then maybe we'll talk and we'll flesh these out a bit further. So after you've mastered desire and aversion, that's the first step. So you assume a skeptical position, you take on some sort of theory or some sort of philosophy, you apply it carefully concerning things that are good and bad. And that's a very strong, things that are really, really good and really, really bad. Then what we're left with there, after what we are motivated towards is what corresponds with what's good or what we take to be good and vice versa, we still need a way to navigate things that are less good. So we need a way to navigate, in the Stoic sense, this would be, how do we navigate indifference? How do we navigate our obligations to things that are not virtue and vice? In other senses, this would just be, I've taken what my core value system is. Perhaps that's pleasure. Perhaps that's obligations to other people. Perhaps that's some sort of deontological Kantian picture or something like this. And then what do I do about these kind of in-between states that don't seem to correspond immediately, or how do I fill these out? In Stoicism, this would be like, how do I flesh out, if I know I want to be virtuous and I don't want to be vicious, how do I flesh out now my obligations to other people, my obligations to my community, to my body, how I should act, and all these other in-between cases. Okay, so the first thing we do is we master our strong desires and our fears. And then the next thing we do is we move to fleshing out how we should act in specific and particular situations, how we should act in specific contexts, giving this value system, right? And so for Epictetus, this is mastering what he calls impulse to act and impulse not to act, which is a gentler form of impulse. And this is the area which corresponds to ethics, so corresponds to particular actions. The first one corresponds to physics because it's about understanding the way the world is. What do I take to be good and take to be bad? And then this is ethics, as in, given that this is good and this is bad and this is the value system I've adopted, how now do I act? How now do I fulfill my obligations to other people and other situations? And for Epictetus, this is the Stoic picture. They're very much connected to this picture of nature, right? So appealing to nature and following our nature. And Epictetus has this picture of Stoic rules. So what this means is when I want to figure out how I should act in situations, what I do is I appeal to different roles that I have and different kinds of roles that form a hierarchy. So at the very top of the hierarchy, what I have is I have my universal role as a human being. So when I'm considering how I should act, I never act in a way that conflicts with this universal role as a human being. And that universal role has some implications. So one of the implications is I don't do things that conflict with virtue. I don't do things that would be vicious. But other obligations we have as a human being is to preserve our body, right? So I would not, if virtue and vice are all that matters to me, I'm not harmed if I lose a hand in a substantial way. But it's still quite strange. I still would not want to be the kind of person who selects to like self-mutilate or selects to harm my body. So when I'm looking for how to navigate particular situations or particular ethical situations, what we do is we appeal to our roles. First role is that as our universal role as a human being, our universal role as an animal and as a rational animal. And that means we act rationally and we respect our body and our physical health when we can. And then the next way, there's kind of this hierarchy and we keep going through it. The next thing we do is we appeal to our particular capacities. So we appeal to our particular talents. So we could conflict against our nature if, you're trying to be kind of person you're not. So you're trying in your ethical pursuit to become an extroverted person when you're really fundamentally an introverted person. Or you're trying to like things that just don't fit with your nature and your capacity and your dispositions. So what Epictetus would say here is in these kind of situations, just honestly appeal and reflect to your capacities and your physical disposition, and use that as information to navigate specific situations. The next thing we do that we can appeal to is we can appeal to our specific relationships with other people. So we appeal to our universal role as a human being. We appeal to our particular role, which is our capacity, our certain capacities. Maybe we're born with a certain disposition. Maybe we like logic, we like math. Maybe we like music. Maybe we're social. And we follow along those to tell us how to act and how to structure and navigate our life. And the next thing you do is you look to your roles in terms of your relationships with other human beings. So you say, well, am I a mother? Am I a father? Am I a friend? So on and so forth. And you flesh out that and you develop that. And so then now we start to get a picture of how this is kind of a program that has to progress sequentially. So one example that Epictetus uses, and he loves these examples, and one that I think is really interesting is he uses the example of a father who is not able to care for his daughter's sick, right? And he runs away from his daughter. He leaves the house. He can't handle the fact that his daughter might die. And the picture here, or the idea here in this situation, is that this is someone who has not mastered desire and aversion. This is someone who has not mastered the first area of study. They think that death is a bad thing. They're afraid of their daughter dying. They haven't come to terms with what their ultimate value system should be under a Stoic picture. And because of that, that's interfering with their capacity to fulfill their obligation to other people. He's not able to fulfill his obligation as a father because he's still afraid. So we work sequentially like this. We master desire and aversion, and then we move to our obligations to specific people and our relationships with specific people, our relationships with ourselves and our specific capacities. And then the last way to reflect on how to structure our lives is just choice. And this is the thing I like about Epictetus and I like about Stoicism, is at the end of the day, if it doesn't conflict with reason, if it doesn't go against your nature as a human being, it doesn't go against your relation, you're not betraying your relationships to other human beings, there's going to be some choices you make in life which are just a matter of choice, just a matter of how you choose to live. So whether or not you go into one career or another, whether or not you pursue one path or another, there's ultimately a part of it is just up to you. And I like that there's this ethical system that leaves space for that being a creative endeavor and not something that, there's not necessarily going to be a wrong answer in that regard. And then the last system, so going through this in order, then once we are in a pretty good position with that, we move on to logic. And this is the last system, which is just how to reason properly. And the idea here is once we've mastered desire and aversion, so reviewing now really quickly, I was trying to fit a lot here into 20 minutes. Reviewing now, we say, look, I want to live intentionally with an intentional value system. I recognize that I'm ignorant and my ignorance is harming me. So I back up. I adopt a skeptical position. I find a philosophy that fits for me. This is Epictetus' beginning to philosophy. Then from there, once I find a value system that fits for me, I reconsider specific objects in relation to that value system. What now does death mean to me? What now does popularity mean to me? What now does my career mean to me in relation to this standard of judgment I've been giving? In the case of Stoicism, it means they're not good or bad because only virtue and vice are good and bad. Once we have that picture in place, then we move to this question of how am I supposed to act in particular situations? How am I supposed to act given this picture of good and bad? Given how am I supposed to navigate particular situations? And as Epictetus asks us to appeal essentially to the way the world is and appeal to information about who we are naturally as rational animals, who we are specifically as people with certain talents and capacities, and who we are interpersonally as members of communities and people with relationships to other people. And then from there, anything that doesn't fall into those three steps can just be creative, you can just pick, you can just decide the kind of life you want to live. And then the last system is logic. So the idea with logic is once I'm in that position, I want to cement that understanding, cement that way of thinking such that I don't fall out of it. And Epictetus talks about cementing it to the point where even if you're drunk or even if you're depressed or you fall into a manic state, you're not going to deviate from this kind of knowledge. And this was for him was just the way of doing this was just actually just studying logic, studying formal ways of thinking, studying kind of logical fallacies that people fall into. And the main takeaway from logic, I would say there's two main takeaways. One is assenting cautiously and intentionally. So cultivating and developing a mindfulness of your situation, your surroundings, and the way you're thinking so that you're not forming beliefs or judgments unintentionally. And the second way of doing it is to, the second big part of logic is facilitating consistency. So what I mean by consistency, and he has these two parts I wrote down here. In our study of logic, we need to work to accept the consequences of what has been properly derived. So this is one thing that I work at. If someone presents and reasons a good argument, working on being the kind of person that is responsive to reason. So even if it doesn't fit your biases, even if it doesn't fit what you wanted the conclusion to be, responding, well, okay, those premises lead to this conclusion, so I'm going to follow and accept that conclusion. And then the second part is accepting that if one's premises produce an absurd or necessary false conclusion, you must re-examine the premises. So the second idea of this is that if your beliefs lead to an inconsistency, or if your beliefs lead to a problem, doing the work to reevaluate those beliefs and doing the work to take a step back and think about how you arrived at that conclusion. And I just think about this as like not being able to function in a state of cognitive dissonance, not being able to function in a state where you have contradictory things simultaneously that you believe. Becoming responsive to reason and the fact that if you have a set of beliefs that contradict with one another, that should be motivating to the point where you reject one. And you seek once again to achieve consistency and realign those beliefs. So I try to, there's just a lot of information there, which I try to cover as quickly as possible. And I'll try to summarize it one more time. But what I wanted to provide a picture of, the main takeaway there was I think sometimes when we engage in Stoicism, it can be like taken as some helpful ideas or some concepts to work around. And you think about the dichotomy of control, or you think about these other concepts. but there really was a system of following. There really was a progression, at least in Epictetus' school, that was meant to be followed in order. And there was a system that was meant to be a lot of work and followed in a specific system. And I tried to flesh a bit out of what that was. So the first was working to master your strong emotions, your passions, by first assuming a skeptical state and then carefully reevaluating things to be good or bad. Next, once we've done that, learning to be responsive to information about who we are generally as rational creatures, particularly given our capacities and given our specific relationships with other people, and learning to be responsive to those reasons when navigating specific situations. And then once we've done that, the third system of logic is learning to be responsive to reason, in terms of when you're having conversations, when you're thinking, if there's some sort of inconsistency, evaluating where that inconsistency is coming from and rejecting one of the premises, or at the very least going back and reevaluating them. And if the premises lead to a conclusion soundly, accepting that conclusion, even if it is not the one you might want. And the idea is, if we progressively work on all three of these and we master these sequentially, that was the picture of how Stoic training was supposed to take place. And I think we get there a really interesting picture of like a fleshed out school and something that's worth like a lifetime of focusing on and developing. So that was a lot of information. I tried to throw it out there, and maybe we can flesh stuff out more in the chat and the discussion. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. And yeah, I like the idea of teasing out those different sections. So I'm going to ask Michael some questions right now to warm us up. If you have any questions, write it in the chat box, and then I'll call on you, and you can kind of unmute yourself, or if you'd like me to read it, just indicate that. One thing I'm curious, it's somewhat like kind of a more personal question with your relationship with Stoicism, but related to something you just said. How did you find your way to Stoicism? How did it grip you personally? And then you mentioned something about, you have to take the skeptical stance, and then you find out what philosophy fits for you. Is there anything more you can add to that? Like, how do you know the philosophy fits for you besides having that maybe that resonance with it?
Yeah, great. So I'm firmly of the belief that intentional living is better than unintentional living, right? Like an examined life is better than an unexamined life. So what I would hate to do, I also know of the position that I'm pretty ignorant. So I would hate to like meet someone who's like, oh, this is a really interesting philosophy that works for me, and be like, you're wrong, you should be a Stoic, you're ridiculous. I'm just not at that position yet. So for me, what happened, I think what draws a lot of people to Stoicism, and what drew me to Stoicism, was I like the idea of accountability for the quality of your life. So one of the core values of Stoicism that I really like is this idea that the quality of your life is up to you. It's not up to circumstances beyond your control. It's up to cultivating your own character. I like what follows from that, which is that every person has the capacity for a good life. Every person has the capacity, if you take a picture that there's certain conditions required for a good life, there's some people who just have bad lives and will have bad lives. There's just nothing that can be done about it. And at least intuitively, if we can develop any sort of system that saves us from that claim, I find it really appealing and attractive. And then another thing I like about it is I think a lot of people underestimate the role of virtue, underestimate the role that kind of your disposition or the way that you think about things. And what I like about Stoicism, like I've been drawn as more towards Aristotelianism and other schools as I study more. But what I like about Stoicism is it like unapologetically emphasizes virtue. It says, you can be happy on the torture rack. And it says like, that is it for a good life. And there's something quite inspiring about that. And I hope it's true. It would be really nice if it is. And in terms of discovering the philosophy that's right for you, I think that, as I said, and this is part of what attracts me to moral education, if you're living with a slightly different moral system, but you're trying your best every day to be good, and you're following intuitions and you're living actively, you're already in like the top, 20, 10 percentile of people. Like, it really matters very little to me um, if what you take to the ultimate ends is slightly different. Obviously, there's some things that are going to be wrong in any system, of like murder or something like this, or like unjust murder out of anger or something. But most ethical systems are quite similar in what they end up asking you to do, and kind of differ in terms of their justification for why that's the right thing to do. So I think it's just like, begin the journey and open yourself up. Like Marcus Aurelius talks about this, and it's like, I'm not interested if I'm interested in the truth. If Stoicism was wrong, I would want to know and learn that. So be open in this journey also for other possibilities. Like, I'm very cautious. I like Stoicism. It helps me be a better person, but I'm cautious of, even though I consider myself a practicing Stoic, of attaching too strongly to it as a label.
Hmm. And you mentioned you're practicing Stoic, and I know you do jiu-jitsu, and you became known for that, like the Stoic guy who does jiu-jitsu. Could you maybe speak on how jiu-jitsu fits in your practice of Stoicism, and how you practice Stoicism in other ways?
Yeah. So in terms of practicing Stoicism, I think one of the best ways, so Epictetus talks about, he says, suspend your judgment. And then what happens is you encounter new situations, and then you apply Stoic theory to that situation. So you suspend your judgment, you encounter a new situation, and you're supposed to evaluate it. And if things go correctly, you go, these people are laughing at me. Oh, it doesn't matter to me. It doesn't have anything to do with vice and virtue. I've been like, I've broken my arm. Okay, well, that's a setback to my body, but it's not a setback to my character. And I think one of the best ways to engage in this kind of process is to have difficult situations. I mean, this is a concept that is talked about reimagining obstacles as tests. And I like jujitsu because it's like the hardest thing that I've found to do. It's really physically difficult. You do it in front of other people. So when you lose, it's very embarrassing. I mean, I had an MMA fight where I got 7 stitches here. I got kneed in the head, and got physically harmed. And 30 people had paid money to come watch me fight. So it was like embarrassing in front of them that I'd lost. And these are just like really, really great opportunities to just practice. Because I'm not perfect, I have this intuition to fall back into judging these things as bad things, or judging myself as being harmed in these situations. And I think the more difficult the situation, the better the practice, the better practice it is dealing with it and evaluating it. And Epictetus makes this analogy to wrestling. It's one of my favorite analogies. And he talks about, you should think about difficulties in your life the way wrestlers think about training partners. And if a wrestler came into a room and they could beat everybody, they'd be like, coach, get me somebody better, get me different people to train with. And if you walk into, in your life, you have no difficulty, Epictetus encourages kind of cultivating this attitude of, well, give me something tougher to do. And that being said, because I'm not a sage, you don't want to go and do something that's like breaks you, is way outside your comfort zone. I also find jiu-jitsu nice because it's low consequence. Martial arts is low consequence. It's high stress, very difficult, but very low consequence. I think perhaps something like public speaking would be like that as well. Something like this, which can be difficult, but doesn't set you back in a substantial way, is a great way to begin and practice that training. That's the main way that I practice my Stoicism. Another thing is just reflecting strongly on Stoic belief. Another way that I practice my Stoicism that's really helpful is in terms of working through emotions. So one thing we didn't get the chance to talk about is the Stoic theory of emotion, which is like really robust and really, really helpful. And it's this idea that our emotions correspond to beliefs about the world. And one thing Stoicism really helped me do was stop viewing emotions as being antagonistic or things that I fought against, and viewing emotions as, well, this emotion is rooted in something. It's rooted in an evaluation about the way the world is. What evaluation is that? Do I want to hold on to that evaluation? Is that something I really believe in? And that's kind of, I would say, the place where, besides doing intentionally difficult things, the place where I practice Stoicism the most is in reflecting on my own emotional life and being like, why am I upset right now? What judgment is producing that? Or even, why am I happy? Is that a judgment that I want to have? And that kind of process of self-reflecting, working through that, is both helpful to be a Stoic, but also helpful in me, like, learning about myself and being happier.
Right, right. Yeah, I like that, because there's this impression that Stoics are, emotionless people. But I found that as well, that to the practice of Stoicism, it created what I like how acceptance commitment therapy calls it, cognitive diffusion. I can kind of like have some distance away from my emotions and my thoughts, so they're not like conflated. And I think by having this, I have a better relationship with my emotional states now. I can kind of lean into them more.
Mm-hmm.
So I totally agree with that. So I'll ask one more question, then we'll open up to the room. The present moment with COVID and the pandemic, uh, how do you think this relates to Stoicism, and how do you think we can practice our Stoicism or use maybe this whole crisis as an opportunity?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that it's like, I think quite stereotypically, I mean, it's quite obviously like a major issue that's like out of our control, in a lot of ways. In some ways, it's actionable in terms of self-isolation, in terms of, perhaps looking out for your community, helping people with things that they can't be helped with, and then just isolating yourself as much as possible. But there's a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety on something that was not produced because of anybody here's fault, and it's not a result of anybody here's mistakes. But nonetheless seems like it has the capacity to harm in what we take to be the most harmful way, which is, death or extreme physical pain, or financial ruin, right? So you have this natural force outside of our control that will be harmful in all the ways people take to be most harmful, if you don't just take the Stoic picture that vice is the only bad. Yeah, that's a huge test. I think one way Stoicism can be helpful is just in a moment-to-moment therapy, in focusing, reverting to the dichotomy of control, focusing on what you can control and what is up to you. Another way that it can be helpful is, I think, in evaluating ourselves as fundamentally rational animals. We're very lucky. I mean, I don't want to speak for everybody's condition because I don't know everybody's situations, but we're lucky to be in this situation at a time where we have the internet, and a time where we have access to information, access to things like this, where we can hopefully still find ways to pass the time that is meaningful and enjoyable, that is intellectual in a sense, and connect with that aspect of our lives. I think perhaps that's not that difficult for the people in this session right now. These are probably the people you are probably more inclined towards that. But I think it's a good opportunity for people to find, there's ways for me to be happy in circumstances that I thought I couldn't be happy. And this is another thing that Seneca talks about that most people probably be familiar with, which is that he recommends to, intentional discomfort. So live in poverty for a couple months, and then for the rest of your life, you think, oh, is this the worst that can happen to me? Is this the worst that can happen? And I think situations like this provide opportunities to realize the capacity for people to step up, the capacity for people to inspire and work together, and still produce meaningful, helpful experiences, even in the face of a pandemic. So then hopefully when that passes, that gives us all a bit more confidence about our robustness and about our anti-fragility than we might have assumed or thought. And I find that inspiring and helpful.
Right. Okay, so let's turn to the questions. Dawn, you had a question. Could you go off mute and ask it to Michael?
Yep, absolutely. Thank you, Peter. Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for that great overview. You had a task and a half there in 20 minutes, and you just about did it. It was a great overview. So I'm fairly new to Stoicism. I'm a fresh Stoic, as I like to call myself, and I'm definitely still finding my way. I love the looking at the world and how we process things as good or bad, and taking that step back and having that distance. But I wonder if there's a risk, and I wonder if I've done it myself, that actually I've distanced myself too far, so that I don't judge too fast, and I don't, I take the pause to think about what my next step is. Can we do the cognitive diffusion too much? Like, can we be at risk of putting too much distance between ourselves and what's happening, so that we become unfeeling, so that we become numb, rather than processing it in the right way, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that I think is helpful is like looking at these schools in dialogue with one another. So Stoicism was around at the same time as skepticism. And what skepticism would say is skepticism and Stoicism both agreed, look, suspend all your judgments until you can know what's true. And the skeptics would say, but you can't know what's true, so you just stay in that suspended state. And the Stoics say, well, no, you can, and then you progress forward, you just do it cautiously and carefully. So one thing we can do, especially if we're coming to Stoicism as a therapy, which I think a lot of people do, is they say, look, I've been sitting in these judgments. I recognize that these judgments are causing me pain and suffering. So I'm going to take a step back from those judgments. That makes me feel better. And there becomes a fear of reintegrating, or there becomes a habit of stepping away that just becomes so practiced that we're not good at taking the step back in and reincorporating things into our value system. I think it's totally possible to do. The Stoics would advocate for you to avoid it. I think one thing that's helpful to avoid it is to recognize that this is a process. So I think what a lot of people want to do, or at least what I wanted to do, I can speak for myself, is you say, look, the goal of Stoicism is to not be upset about what I shouldn't be upset about. I don't care about anything. Done. I've achieved the goal of Stoicism. And that's not the goal of Stoicism. The goal of Stoicism is to feel the right way about things. So not be upset about things that don't deserve your upsetness, and to feel good about things that you should feel good about. And when we think about it like that, there's that initial jump to pull away too much. But if we forgive ourselves and we say, look, we're Stoics in progress. The Stoic sage came once every 500 years. I'm going to reintegrate things. And in the process of allowing myself to care about virtue and care in the right way about my family and my friends, I'm going to care about when my friend made fun of me, or I'm going to make a mistake, and that's going to hurt when it shouldn't hurt. And we have to forgive ourselves and allow mistakes in reintegration. I think if you do that, it's a reasonable process.
That's really helpful, actually. I love that. I've just written that down. The key is not to feel things, but to feel the right way about things. That absolutely nails it, I think, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you. And I won't beat myself up quite so much when I'm like, am I feeling the right thing, or am I not feeling anything at all? So that's super helpful. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Tom.
Cool. Greg Lopez, you had, I think, 2 questions.
Yes, I do, but I'll just take one for now, and if there's time, I'll go for the other one. Thank you, Michael. I've been seeing your work for a while and really appreciate your master's thesis as well. My main question is about something interesting you said at the very beginning, where you kind of, as the first step of the Stoic is you kind of go off on your own and suspend judgment about your values, and that's kind of the first step, and that's your take on or Epictetus is your interpretation of the discipline of action. So Epictetus was primarily teaching students away at college, I think, according to my understanding. They were essentially going away, young men, wealthy men who were in training, and they had the opportunity to do this. It's kind of like a monkhood of sorts, going off to college. And so modern Stoics, when they pick this up, don't have that luxury. We can't go off to Stoic college and go to a dorm and try to be Stoic and learn the theory first and then walk around and suspend our judgments about values. So how would you suggest modern Stoics go about living their lives as family members and having the jobs they have and stuff, while still holding their desires lightly?
Yeah, great. This is great. So thanks so much for the question. Yeah, there was so much to cover. I wish I could pull into it. So specifically what he says is not to suspend desire and aversion, do nothing. He says suspend desire and aversion and limit yourself only to impulse to act and impulse not to act. And these are technical terms, but the impulse is a gentler feeling. And I mean, Gregor, I'm sure you're familiar with this, but it's something. So the example I like to think of impulse, I think of it like, ooh, I really want to go get ice cream. But if I don't get ice cream, I'm not going to let that ruin my day. So there was an impulse. I planned my day. I walked to the store. I motivated myself. I recognized that good would be coming, but it's a very gentle kind of good. And when I don't get the ice cream, I'm like, okay, that is not preferable, but I'm not crying. I'm not angry. I'm not like mad. Why didn't I'm not mad at myself. Why didn't I look up if the ice cream place was open or not? So the Epictetus' position is that these passions, or my interpretation of Epictetus, is that these passions are produced by desire and aversion. So he says this outright. Passions are produced alone by desire and aversion. Impulse to act and not act, which are when we judge something to be preferred or dispreferred, so preferable or not preferable, those don't produce passions. So those are able to motivate, but they don't leave us in a passionate state. So the idea is at the start, it's not become apathetic. It's apathetic, become not passionate, but it's not don't be motivated. The picture is at the start, motivate yourself gently. Okay, so I'm still going to do this job interview. I'm still going to go to work. I'm still going to, attempt to impress that person I want to like me. But I'm going to view it as this would be preferable if this happens. I don't let that strong feeling of, oh, I really want this to come. And then what he's going to say is eventually you're going to unlock that strong feeling, but you're just going to point it to virtue or vice.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Greg, do you want to sneak your other question in there?
If you'd like, and I'm not cutting anybody else off. So the second question is a little more technical. It's about logic. I know, so you're following Pierre Hadot's model of logic being associated with the third topic, but my understanding of the beginning of Stoic training is that you actually sit down in a classroom, learn some basic logic, and in order to suss out what the Stoic ideas of good and bad actually are, because you can derive that virtue is the only good. It's not an axiom. And you do that by looking at these psychological components called preconceptions, prolepses, and you just try to tease apart how you're sussing good and bad and getting a clear idea of it. Then you go and start your training. So I'm curious if you could say, when did logic come into play in Epictetus's training program? Was it really just toward the end, or was there a touch at the beginning and then it was focused on at the end?
Yeah, great. So no, I think that's a fair assessment. So when I was talking about progressing, this is a progression of mastery. So the idea is you study them sequentially. You don't study them sequentially, you master them sequentially. The first one is the most important, because if you're in a passionate state, you're not going to be receptive. You take someone who's in a passionate state and you sit them down and you derive why virtue is the only good. They're gonna be like shut up. They're not gonna care, right? They're not gonna be receptive to reason. So I think the first thing is to get people out of that passionate state as soon as possible. But then obviously you need some capacity to reason. You need some capacity to follow arguments, to study. It is just that this cannot be mastered until the end, because A, it can't be mastered until you've gone away with passions, and B, what you're mastering is you're mastering your knowledge. You're solidifying your knowledge in the transition towards virtue, right? And you can't solidify what isn't there. So you have to be fleshed out and in a good position in the first two areas of study before you can solidify. But if we take a step back, the third area of study, Epictetus says, if the first one corresponds to desire and aversion, and the second one corresponds to impulses, the third one corresponds to assent. So the third area of study, Epictetus says, is about assent. So it's just about making sure that we give our assent, our belief, we judge to be true, the correct things in the correct way. And obviously you're going to be doing that at any step. You're just not going to be able to master it until you've got your emotions and the passions under control. And yeah, that would be the picture.
Cool. Thank you.
Cool. And we'll end off with a question from Ben. Ben, you had two questions. Maybe you can choose one and ask it to Michael. It's Ben A.
Hi, Ben.
Let me see if is he still in the chat?
He's here. Yeah, I think he's just on mute, maybe.
Okay. He's not on mute. Ben, can you hear us? Okay. I might have a difficulty. I'll ask this question. His mic's not working. Okay, let me ask this first one. Okay, so this is from Ben. How would one assess and evaluate progress in moral education? How do we determine whether or not our training in Stoicism or any other intentional way of living is effective?
Yeah, great. So in Stoicism, you're progressing towards knowledge, knowledge of the way the world is. And there's so much aspects of Stoic psychology I love and I would love to dig into, but they're intellectualists, which means that our motivations are derived from our judgments and our emotions are derived from our judgments. So I pursue things because I view them a certain way, and I feel anger, sadness, joy, because I think certain things have happened to me that I evaluate to be good or bad. So progress would be thinking the right things about things, right? Gaining knowledge, successfully categorizing more and more things in the correct way, successfully thinking about more and more things in the correct way. This would be progress. And now in terms of how you evaluate it, I would say in Stoicism, it's a very personal philosophy. You can evaluate it by your physical state. So in Stoicism, lucky for us, according to the Stoics, God has put us in a position where we can achieve all things that are good and avoid all things that are bad, right? Because what's good and bad is virtue and vice. So if you feel yourself being frustrated or feeling really strong emotions about the world, this is because you're, in the Stoics' perception, you're putting value judgments that are incorrect onto the world. So I think the way you would evaluate progress in Stoicism is your equanimity, your feeling of tranquility, your feeling of your capacity to deal with hardships and maintain a smooth motion through them. But that can be quite significant. So then other things you pick up is just psychological skills. So you can evaluate your progress by being, well, I made a mistake there, but I noticed I made a mistake. I succumbed to that temptation, but I held out a little bit longer than I did before. And just becoming, I think, one of the best ways to start in Stoicism is just this mindfulness or more awareness of kind of psychological processes and how they function. People talk a lot about journaling in this respect as a helpful tool to that. In terms of other systems, I would say what any ethical system should have, it should have a consistency between, when we look at it as moral education and not just theoretical, I think a good way to evaluate it is consistency between beliefs and actions, right? So for the Stoics, there's always consistency between beliefs and actions. If you believe something, you will do it. So if you have a problem in your actions, you have a problem in your beliefs, and you need to reevaluate and be honest with yourself. But for other schools of thought, like Aristotle or something like this, there's a animalistic side, there's a habituation aspect. So I think a good way to gauge progress is to just gauge, well, if I think X is good, if I think it's good to work out and reach out to my family and be kind to the people I see and journal twice a day, am I doing these kind of things? So is there a connection between what I set out in my mind as good plans and the way that I act? Because regardless of what your value system is, if that connection is broken, you're never going to be able to manifest that value system. So for me, that is a really good way of gauging progress. I would rather have someone who is ignorant but consistent than someone who seems knowledgeable but is inconsistent, because the inconsistency, it becomes perhaps more complicated where the issue is. If someone is consistent, you just need to educate them or change their opinion. So I think that's a good way to evaluate your own progress, regardless of what you believe. Am I consistent? Do I do what I think is good? Do I avoid what I think is bad?
Mm-hmm. Very cool. So we'll end this here. Michael, before we go do closing thoughts, do you have any kind of closing words yourself on anything that was said today?
Yeah, that was my first time trying to flesh that out in time. please, I mean, please, anybody, if you're more interested in it, continue to like reach out to me. I would love to talk about it casually. I'm really interested in this stuff. But the picture that I wanted to give was just that there's a kind of an overall project that you're engaging in. And if you want to transform yourself, educate yourself in that project and take part in that project, not just in certain concepts. Like the dichotomy of control can be helpful, but there's more to Stoicism to flesh out. And then another thing, I guess, is seeing this difference and highlighting this difference between, you know, what you take to be good and how you act, and looking at a project of moral education as, I guess, that pursuit of consistency, that pursuit of acting in accordance with what you take to be good. And I guess I just want to leave off with how important I think that project is, and recognizing that project as being separate in some ways from just the study of ethics or just the study of philosophy theoretically.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
But thanks, everybody. I really enjoyed it. I really appreciate the time.
Yeah. So I'll make some announcements in a moment, but Michael, thanks so much, my friend, for coming to the Stoa. That was lovely. I'd love to have you back. And thanks everyone for the wonderful questions today. So for the next events at the Stoa, you can visit the website, and you can also sign up for the mailing list. 3 of these are going to be rescheduled, but the next one's going to be a more fat-day sort of meditation exercise on April 1st at 7 p.m. I think that's a Wednesday. And then the one after that is on a Thursday with our friend Michael Adam Robert from the Side View. He's doing philosophy, the practice for death and dying. So that should be an exciting one. So I'm viewing the Stoa in this time of need as a gift for everyone to freely use. And if you're inspired to provide a gift in return, you can go to the Stoa website and check out the gift economy section at the bottom of the page for more information. All right. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.